Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this great event. Thank you very much, in particular, to the translators to give us the opportunity to speak in English. And I will try to speak slowly and clearly and in complete sentences, which isn't in my nature, but I will try. Okay, so talking about Leninism in Brussels, I thought that it was only right to begin with Marcel Liebman and the famous book on Leninism that was mentioned this morning. And as Liebman there refers to Leninism under Lenin, and not as I'm doing with my title, really as Leninism, or rather as Lenin as something leading to Leninism, following in sequence, I think it's obvious that we're talking about rather different things when we're referring to Leninism. Liebman certainly recognised the arguments which I would draw upon, which is that Leninism as a concept only really gained currency at the time of Lenin's final illness and his death. And Liebman talks in that period of the congealing of doctrine into dogma and the sacralization of the figure of Lenin himself. And like others in the decades after 1956, I think Liebman was one of those who sought the renewal of Marxism through the recovery of older socialist traditions, and more specifically through the recovery of Leninism from the dead weight of Stalinism. And there were others who broadly supported that view. Stephen Cohen, in his biography of Bukharin, perhaps. Moshe Levin, certainly in Lenin's final struggle. Cohen described the idea that Stalinism was a development of Bolshevism rather than a break with Bolshevism as what he called the continuity school or the continuity thesis. And in a sense, that relates to some of the discussions that have already been taking place at this conference, the tension between continuity and discontinuity. I personally don't think it's particularly helpful to think in terms of those simplistic categories. It would certainly be unjust to Liebman and Levin and others to refer to them as a sort of discontinuity school and to oversimplify in the same way. Nevertheless, Liebman's basic argument did centre on what he called the essential differences and basic incompatibility between Leninism and Stalinism. And in just the same way, Moshe Levin referred to two very different political and cultural universes that were almost battling for the soul of Bolshevism in the 1920s. So Liebman in that book, as I read it anyway, is trying to stress the gulf between the authentic Leninism of Lenin's own day and its degeneration, its distortion, and its misappropriation by Lenin's successors, and obviously, most particularly by Stalin. Now, the relevance of this to my theme and the focus on the cult of the individual is that in detailing these differences, Liebman focused above all, as he put it, on Stalin's personal dictatorship and what Liebman referred to as the cult of personality. So in these brief comments, I just want to reflect a little on this tension between continuity and discontinuity in respect of the cult phenomenon, which, as we all know, does become so integral to the political culture of Stalinism. The first point I'd make is that I am not a Soviet specialist like all the other distinguished speakers we've had so far at this conference. I became interested in the cult of the individual as a historian of international communism, and through the examples I found of how these cultic practices were reproduced, disseminated, adapted, or contested internationally. And before I return to Lenin and Leninism, I just want to emphasize 3 particular points that I drew from that research that might be relevant in the present context. The first point would be that the collective veneration of particular individuals is a far-reaching phenomenon, traceable in many social and political environments. And it therefore has to be addressed in terms of political function, political ideology, and not just personal urges and personality traits. For example, Lenin's modesty as against Stalin's megalomania. I don't think if that matters, and I suppose it does in a way, to me it's a secondary point. My second point is that the communist version of this phenomenon, the cult of certain individuals, was one which had complex origins and conditioning factors, and these included deep roots in the European radical tradition. Accounts of the Lenin and Stalin cults, and there is an extensive literature on those, of course, these accounts usually emphasize specifically Russian features. The legacy of the Tsars, what J. Arch Getty refers to as the deep continuities of Russian history, which I suppose in a way is a rather different sort of continuity thesis. There's obviously something in that. Moshe Levin also makes a lot of those features. Nevertheless, it's worth recalling that the very phrase, the cult of the individual, or the cult of personality, although we tend to identify it with the Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, doesn't originate in Soviet times. It was actually Marx who in 1877 disowned the personam cultus in relation to himself that was being constructed around the figure of Marx himself. And it was therefore Marx who unwittingly provided Khrushchev with his text for the secret speech, and Marx therefore who reminds us that there were traditions of the radical or socialist hero that long predated the Russian revolutions, and which Marx also reminds us, were always a matter of debate and contestation. They could always be rejected. And my third point is that even within communism, there was therefore no single phenomenon of the cult of the individual. And actually, if we look more broadly than the communist movement, the most disparate causes and political movements have become embodied in cult-like figures. Trying to account for these complexities within the communist movement, in the book that I wrote, I employ as heuristic devices the ideas of the integrating and the enkindling cult. Summarized very crudely, the integrating cult is a single, manufactured, centralizing symbol serving to bind more closely together a particular cult community, like the Soviet state or party, or the international cult community of Cold War communism. If I were to think of a Belgian example, thanks to the work of José Gotovich, I would think of, for example, the manufactured cult, the purely manufactured cult of Edgar Laumont in the PCB in the Cold War years. Enkindling cults, on the other hand, tended to be exploited rather than simply manufactured. That's to say that they arose from some sort of source beyond the immediate control of the party or political movement initially, and served to personify a cause for the broader movements they stirred into life. The classic example within the communist movement would be Georgy Dimitrov in the 1930s. At the time of the Reichstag fire trial at the end of 1933, nobody has really heard of Dimitrov. They certainly wouldn't have identified a Bulgarian Comintern functionary to personify the resistance of the German workers to the Nazis. But nevertheless, it's Dimitrov who, in a sense, seizes that opportunity at the Reichstag fire trial, denounces the Nazis from the dock, and then there is constructed a sort of cult around him. A Belgian example might be Joseph Jacquemot towards the very end of his life, who is used to symbolise the turn towards the Popular Front in the late 30s and immediately after his death. Returning, I should say that enkindling, by the way, is a phrase I took from Edward Bernstein in his book on La Salle, published in the 19th century. A reminder again that there are older traditions of cult building. Enkindling, in French, I think one could think of it as a culte de rassemblement, stirring something into flames. So returning to Lenin, with these distinctions in mind, it seems to me that making too much of discontinuity can also be making too much of factors of contingency and personality. The differences of scale with Stalin's later cult or Lenin's undeniable personal modesty. The key point is not that Lenin craved mass adulation, because he obviously didn't. It's that he did recognise, even in the period that we've been talking about this morning, he recognised how his prestige was an asset that could be used in the interests of the revolution. And it was the interests of the revolution that were his overriding priority. In other words, if you could agree to treaties with capitalist states to secure the revolution, why not agree to being filmed from time to time in the Kremlin gardens and sitting for a portrait or whatever it might be? So, in his overriding concern with maintaining the gains of the revolution, Lenin did clearly recognise the functionality of his embryonic cult, and he didn't, by and large, stand in the way of it or speak out against it. And there was clearly, in respect to the terms that I just used, there was clearly both an enkindling and an integrating aspect to Lenin's cult. The enkindling aspect is particularly clear in an international context, as Lenin symbolised the cause of the revolution for an international left-wing public. Already in the Civil War period, portraits, biographies and artefacts began to proliferate. In the British socialist press, I was somewhat amazed to find that the first poem dedicated to Lenin appears in Sylvia Pankhurst's Workers' Dreadnought in March 1918. Very early, almost as early as this is happening in Russia, in fact. Of course, there was also this enkindling function in Russia, and through image, text, and the willingness to meet with visiting delegations, Lenin became the figure of the revolution personified for a wider Soviet public. Nevertheless, by the time of his death in January 1924, to me, it was the integrating effect of the authority that was vested in Lenin which mattered more. In the histories that I've read, there is no real suggestion of any external threat to Soviet rule by this time. And by external threat, I'm also thinking of movements within if you like, the Russian population or the Soviet population. The rule of a Bolshevik rule was firmly grounded in the authority of the ruling party, albeit this was now reinforced by the posthumous cult of Lenin. Nevertheless, what might have destabilized the regime wasn't external threats, but the inner party succession crisis that was already prefigured during his final illness. It wasn't just that the figure of Lenin was now vested with renewed symbolic potency as one around which both party and people could unite. For most leading Bolsheviks, there was also the fact that the only revolutionary leader of such stature that he might have succeeded to Lenin's mantle as an individual was Trotsky, of course. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that Trotsky himself desired such a cult, but nevertheless, Trotsky's was the only cult or collective veneration of a leader as embodiment of the revolution that one could easily imagine in 1924. Certainly, it was some such threat or innuendo that provided a major theme for the dominant party fraction, which Max Eastman characterized as the anti-Bonaparte fraction. Max Eastman, of course, Trotsky's American follower of the period. Whatever the explanation for it, everybody seems to agree that the Lenin cult reached its apogee in the 2 years immediately following Lenin's death. I'm thinking now of historians like Benno Enke and Nina Tumarkin, who've written on this. In terms of its function, this wasn't as yet the cult of any living individual seen as Lenin's successor. In other words, the cult of, such as the cult of Stalin, as would later emerge. This was the cult of the collective Lenin of the party in which Lenin's legacy was embodied. And to this extent, it was a sort of anti-cult of the individual Trotsky. And this, in my view, is where the issue of Leninism comes in. And it's also no coincidence that Leninism as a concept gained currency at just the moment that Lenin's cult really takes off. They're exactly the same period. And I'd think of this in terms of Lenin's double embalmment. Of course, we all remember the physical embalmment in the Red Square Mausoleum, with just Lenin's brain removed for separate study in the very cult-like Institute of the Brain. And that, of course, would bear out the discontinuity thesis, if that's how we're to think of it. Lenin would never have entertained such a notion, and Bolsheviks like, for example, Lenin's widow, Krupskaya, openly expressed their grave concerns about such a process. But there was a second form of embalmment, in my view, and this was a process of ideological embalmment in the form of Leninism. And from this second form of embalmment, nobody appears to have dissented, or nobody among the leading Bolsheviks. By the ideological embalmment, I mean the codification of Lenin's legacy as a corpus of teaching and example that remained embodied in the party he had created. Studies of the cults, and as I say, there are many, usually focus on images or on biography. But in my view, one of the quintessential cult productions was the publication of the leaders' collected works. This is a fetishistic enterprise intended to represent the unity of theory and practice through what were often the most fragmentary, banal, or inconsequential of texts. This was seen as indispensable in Lenin's case because his theoretical legacy was not captured in major theoretical writings like those of Marx. Bukharin, for example, makes precisely that point. So the necessity to... the project on Lenin's work starts well before his death. And the Lenin Institute, which is devoted to this enterprise, is established in 1923. But it obviously continues as a feature of Marxism-Leninism in the years and decades that follow. In Dziga Vertov's Lenin Cult film, 3 Songs of Lenin, that's made for the 10th anniversary of his death in 1934. In that film, Vertov has some footage of Lenin's works as they come rolling off the printing press. And I think it's a fantastic and evocative image that combines the cult of the word, the cult of the leader, and the cult of the machine in a truly emblematic image of this Stalinized Bolshevik culture. So the works, I think, are very interesting in themselves. I would love to trace historically this phenomenon of the leader's works. The earliest example I found would be, actually, this is going long before 1917, James I, English king, who expounds the idea of the divine right of kings in his volume of works in the early 17th century. Louis Napoleon Le Petit, he publishes state-sponsored works in the 1850s. As any historian of the French Communist Party would be able to tell you, this was also very much a feature of the cult of Maurice Thorez. And this great enterprise of publishing Thorez works in the early 1950s, almost to compensate for the fact that Thorez as an individual is at that point in the Soviet Union again. And I would say, in the case of both Stalin and Thorez, the scale of the publishing enterprise was only matched by the utter banality of the texts and utterances brought together in this way for collective veneration. So I would end with 2 brief points, trying to bring these arguments together. The first point is really the obvious one, and that is that it was this cult of Leninism and the collective Lenin of the party that Stalin would then appropriate for his own ends as the so-called best disciple of Lenin, or the Lenin of today, the phrase that's used in Barbuse's book about Stalin. This disciple of Lenin whose claims were exercised through cultic practices that were in a way prefigured in Lenin's time, but taken to a whole new extent under Stalin's, a qualitatively different dimension. So that's the obvious point. My second point would be that none of the leading Bolsheviks dissented in any significant way from the cultic practices that were then turned against them. Trotsky, I don't think, did in this period. He staked his own claim to the Lenin legacy. In the memoir of Lenin that he published after Lenin's death, in the English edition, one can also find his eulogies to Lenin written during Lenin's lifetime under the headings Lenin wounded, Lenin ill, and then, with Lenin's death, Lenin dead. And like 3 stations of the cross, it becomes Trotsky's posthumous tribute to Lenin. So I don't think there is certainly dissent from the physical embalmment of Lenin in Red Square, but not from this process of ideological embalmment. And I would just end with Boris Souvarine, obviously French communist of the 1920s, and a letter that he wrote to Trotsky in June 1929 to complain of how the opposition had really sought to compete with the party majority on these terms. In fact, if I've just got a minute, I'll read it in French so you can see how I would have murdered your language had I spoken in French. En prenant le nom de bolchevique léniniste, l'opposition a fait l'aveu de rivaliser avec la majorité dans une émulation de conformisme pseudo-léninien, de fidélité à la lettre des textes de Lénine, d'ailleurs choisi et isolé comme s'il y a trouvé des réponses définitives à toutes les questions posées par l'histoire. Dans les écrits de l'opposition, il n'y a pas un seul exemple d'allusion critique à un acte, à une parole de Lénine. Et ne s'est pas trouvé un iconoclaste pour protester publiquement contre la divinisation de Lénine et la biblification de son œuvre. And I largely agree with those sentiments. In a way, Souverine, through his, what I think is still a brilliant book on Stalin, in a sense, he was one of the precursors of the discontinuity school, I suppose. He emphasizes the differences between Lenin and Stalin. But what we can see from that letter, he also saw, even before the first emergence of Stalin's cult, which is first launched, I should add, at the end of 1929 with Stalin's 50th birthday, what Souverine saw was how the cult at once of Lenin and Leninism had served as the instrument of Stalin's ascendancy over his personally more gifted rivals. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup.